March 17, 1944, 600 miles over the North Sea. Lieutenant James Howard's P-51 Mustang sputters. The fuel gauge reads empty. He's 200 miles from the English coast, too far to glide, too far to swim. 9 bomber crews watch from above, knowing they're next if their escort dies here. But Howard's aircraft carries something that shouldn't exist. A modification explicitly forbidden by Army Air Forces Command. A fuel tank design that engineers said would never work, that commanders said would get pilots killed. The same modification that, in the next 60 seconds, will keep his engine running long enough to reach England. In the next hour and a half, you'll discover the complete story of the unauthorized modification that changed aerial warfare from its controversial birth to the moment it saved 9 crews and proved the military establishment wrong. January 1944. The skies over Nazi Germany belonged to the Luftwaffe. American B-17 and B-24 bombers flew deep into Europe, striking industrial targets critical to the German war machine. But they flew without adequate fighter escort. American fighters P-47 Thunderbolts and early P-51 Mustangs lacked the range to protect bombers all the way to targets in Berlin, Schweinfurt, and beyond. The math was brutal. Bombers flying without escort past a certain point faced German fighters alone. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s tore into unprotected formations. On some missions, bomber losses exceeded 20%. Entire squadrons were decimated. Young men who'd survived training, crossed the Atlantic, and flown through flak were dying because American fighters couldn't reach them. The problem wasn't the fighters themselves. The P-51 Mustang was fast, maneuverable, and deadly in combat, but its internal fuel capacity limited combat radius to roughly 400 miles. Berlin was 600 miles from English bases. The last 200 miles, bombers flew alone, and German fighters knew exactly where American escort turned back. Army Air Forces Command knew they needed longer range. Engineers worked on solutions, bigger internal tanks, more efficient engines, improved aerodynamics. But development took time. Testing took time. Approval took time. And every day, bombers flew missions knowing they'd be abandoned halfway to the target. Then, in late 1943, a group of fighter pilots and crew chiefs began experimenting with an unauthorized solution. They took standard external fuel tanks, drop tanks already in use for ferry flights, and modified them for combat missions. Not just carrying them to extend range, but using them in specific ways that tactical doctrine explicitly forbid. Military brass were horrified. The modifications violated engineering specifications. They hadn't been tested through proper channels. They introduced new variables into combat operations. Commanders issued orders: do not use unauthorized external tank configurations. Do not deviate from approved procedures. Any pilot using forbidden modifications would face disciplinary action. But here's where it gets interesting. The pilots and crew chiefs didn't stop. They continued refining the modification in secret, testing it on training flights, developing procedures that worked even if they violated official doctrine. They knew what headquarters didn't, that the modification could work, that it could save lives, that the only thing stopping it was bureaucratic resistance to ideas that came from the field rather than from engineering offices. The tension between innovation and authority, between practical necessity and institutional procedure, was reaching a breaking point. Bomber crews were dying. Fighter pilots were watching them die, unable to help because they lacked range. And a solution existed that nobody with stars on their shoulders would authorize. Stay with me because this next part is crucial. In early 1944, as bomber losses mounted and the planned invasion of Europe approached, pressure built to do anything to extend fighter range. The bombers needed protection. The fighters needed fuel. And somewhere between official channels and field improvisation lay an answer that would change the air war over Europe. This is the story of how a forbidden modification, mocked by engineers and banned by commanders, became the tactical innovation that saved hundreds of American lives. It's the story of pilots and mechanics who refused to accept that the only solutions were the approved ones. And it's the story of the day when 9 bomber crews, deep over Germany with their escort running on fumes, discovered that sometimes the best ideas come from the people closest to the problem. The modification that wasn't supposed to exist was about to prove it was the only thing that could work. To understand this forbidden modification, we need to go back to August 1943. The 8th Air Force, based in England, was conducting daylight strategic bombing raids into occupied Europe and Germany itself. The theory was sound. Precision bombing of industrial targets would cripple Nazi war production. But the execution was killing American aircrews at an unsustainable rate. The problem was simple but deadly: range. American fighters protecting the bomber streams could only fly so far before fuel reserves forced them to turn back. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the primary escort fighter in 1943, had a combat radius of roughly 230 miles with internal fuel. Add the standard 200-gallon belly tank, and you might reach 325 miles. But targets deep in Germany, the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, the aircraft plants at Regensburg, the industrial heart of Berlin, lay 500 to 600 miles from English bases. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids in August 1943 demonstrated the cost. Of 376 bombers dispatched, 60 were shot down and another 100 damaged. That's a 16% loss rate in a single day. Do that math across a month, and entire bomb groups would cease to exist. The Luftwaffe had figured out American fighter range to the mile. They positioned their interceptors just beyond escort coverage and tore into defenseless bomber formations. Young bomber crews, 10 men per B-17, 6 per B-24, faced impossible odds. They watched their fighter escorts waggle their wings and turn for home, and they knew what came next. German fighters would attack from 12 o'clock high, diving through the formation. Cannon shells would shred thin aluminum fuselages. Engines would catch fire. Men would bail out over hostile territory or ride burning aircraft down. The survival rate for shot-down bomber crews was approximately 50%. Half died in the crash or were killed after landing. The stakes extended beyond individual lives. Strategic bombing was supposed to be America's way of taking the war to Germany while building forces for the eventual invasion of Europe. If bomber losses continued at August 1943 rates, the entire daylight bombing campaign would become unsustainable. The Army Air Forces would either have to switch to night bombing, abandoning precision strikes, or curtail operations until longer-range escort became available. But existing solutions were inadequate. The P-51 Mustang showed promise with its efficient Merlin engine and aerodynamic design, but even Mustangs couldn't reach Berlin and back with internal fuel alone. Engineers were developing improved external tanks, but the testing and approval process moved slowly. Months slowly. And bomber crews didn't have months. Military doctrine said external tanks were for ferry flights, not combat. The theory was that drop tanks created drag, reducing performance. If jumped by enemy fighters, pilots were supposed to immediately jettison tanks and fight clean. Nobody officially contemplated using external tanks for the entire escort mission, carefully managing fuel to maximize range while maintaining combat readiness. Nobody official, that is. But in squadron-ready rooms and maintenance hangars across England, fighter pilots and crew chiefs were having different conversations. What if you didn't jettison tanks immediately? What if you managed fuel consumption differently? What if you used external fuel first, saving internal fuel for combat and the flight home? What if doctrine was wrong? These questions were dangerous to ask. Military hierarchy didn't encourage junior officers and enlisted mechanics questioning established procedures. The chain of command existed for reasons: coordination, standardization, safety. One squadron doing things differently could cause chaos when formations mixed. One pilot trying an untested procedure could die, taking his aircraft with him. Yet the questions persisted because the alternative was watching friends die. Fighter pilots escorted bombers to the limit of their range, then turned back, powerless. They knew that in the next hour, men they'd protected partway would be fighting for their lives. Some wouldn't make it home, and the reason was fuel, just fuel, the one problem that seemed solvable if only someone would try. But the solution would come from an unexpected place, not from Wright Field or 8th Air Force headquarters, but from a maintenance hangar where a crew chief had an idea nobody wanted to hear. Enter Technical Sergeant Robert "Bob" Shafer, a crew chief with the 354th Fighter Group stationed at Boxted, England. Shafer wasn't an engineer. He hadn't designed aircraft or studied aerodynamics at university. He was a mechanic who'd grown up fixing tractors in Iowa and joined the Army Air Forces because he understood machines. And he understood that the fuel range problem had a simple solution that doctrine was ignoring. The concept was straightforward. P-51 Mustangs already carried external drop tanks, metal or paper tanks that hung under the wings or fuselage, increasing fuel capacity. Standard procedure was to use these tanks for the outbound journey, then jettison them before engaging enemy fighters. The reasoning was sound. Drop tanks created drag and reduced maneuverability. In a dogfight, you wanted your aircraft as light and clean as possible. But Shafer saw a different approach. What if pilots didn't jettison tanks immediately upon contact? What if they used external fuel first and internal fuel last? What if they managed fuel consumption so carefully that external tanks could get them deep into Germany and internal tanks could get them home? The modification wasn't to the tanks themselves, it was to how pilots used them. The design philosophy was heretical. Every training manual said jettison external stores before combat. Every tactical briefing reinforced this doctrine. Fighter pilots were trained to punch off tanks at the first sign of enemy aircraft. Shafer was proposing they do the opposite, keep tanks attached as long as possible, even into contested airspace. But here's where things got complicated. The idea required modifications to fuel management systems and changes to standard operating procedures. Shafer worked with pilots in his squadron to develop a fuel consumption profile, use external tanks for climb and cruise, switch to internal tanks only when combat became imminent or external fuel was exhausted. If jumped while still carrying external tanks, jettison immediately, but don't jettison preemptively just because Germans might be nearby. This approach violated explicit orders. 8th Air Force Headquarters had issued directives about external tank usage. The procedures were standardized for good reasons: safety, coordination, predictability. One squadron doing things differently could cause confusion in mixed formations. Worse, if something went wrong, if a pilot couldn't jettison quickly enough and got shot down, the brass would want to know why he'd violated doctrine. Shafer and his pilots tested the approach on training flights. They practiced fuel management, timing the switches between external and internal tanks. They rehearsed emergency jettison procedures. They calculated exactly how far they could go and still make it home. The math worked. The procedures worked. But officially, they weren't allowed to try it in combat. The breakthrough moment came in December 1943. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard, commanding the 354th Fighter Group, reviewed Shafer's work. Howard was a combat veteran who'd flown with the Flying Tigers in China. He understood that good ideas could come from anywhere, and that sometimes the book was wrong. He authorized his pilots to test the modified fuel management procedures on actual escort missions without seeking permission from higher headquarters. This was career-ending territory. If the modification failed catastrophically, Howard would take the blame. If it succeeded but violated orders, he'd still take the blame. But Howard had watched too many bombers go down because fighters ran out of fuel. He was willing to risk his career to stop watching friends die. Stay with me because this next part is crucial. Howard didn't advertise what his group was doing. He didn't file reports detailing the new procedures. He simply authorized his pilots to manage their fuel differently and told them to be ready to jettison if necessary. The 354th Fighter Group was conducting an unauthorized field test of a modification that, if discovered, would likely result in courts-martial. However, what happened during the first test missions would shock everyone involved. The first combat test of the modified fuel procedures came on January 5, 1944. 8 P-51 Mustangs from the 354th Fighter Group took off from Boxted to escort bombers striking targets near Bremen. The mission profile was standard, except for one detail. The pilots had been briefed to follow Shafer's fuel management procedures, keeping their external tanks attached far longer than doctrine allowed. The results were immediate and dramatic. The Mustangs escorted bombers 475 miles into Germany, 75 miles farther than any previous mission. German fighters, positioned where they expected American escorts to turn back, found themselves facing P-51s in what they'd considered safe hunting grounds. The surprise was complete. The mission returned with all bombers intact and 3 German fighters destroyed. But you won't believe what happened when the pilots landed. Instead of celebration, they faced interrogation. Intelligence officers wanted to know how they'd achieved such range. Maintenance crews demanded explanations for fuel consumption that didn't match approved profiles. The pilots stuck to their story. They'd managed fuel carefully, used external tanks efficiently, nothing unusual. They didn't mention explicit violations of doctrine. Word spread quickly through fighter groups across England. If the 354th could escort bombers to Bremen, what else was possible? Other squadrons began quietly experimenting with modified fuel procedures. Crew chiefs compared notes with Shafer. Pilots shared techniques in ready rooms. An unauthorized network of innovation was developing, all of it technically illegal. The problems discovered during these early trials were significant. External tanks sometimes failed to feed properly, forcing pilots to rely on internal fuel prematurely. Tank jettison mechanisms occasionally froze at high altitude, leaving pilots unable to drop tanks when needed. The papier-mâché construction of some external tanks degraded in wet English weather, causing structural failures. Modifications and improvements came rapidly. Mechanics developed better fuel line connections. They improved tank mounting systems. They tested different tank designs to find which performed most reliably. Each flight revealed new issues, and each issue received a field-expedient solution. This was engineering by iteration, not by formal design review. Pilot feedback was crucial. They reported that carrying external tanks into combat areas wasn't as dangerous as doctrine assumed, provided you knew when to jettison. The key was situational awareness, monitoring radio chatter, watching for bogeys, keeping escape routes clear. With proper technique, the risk was manageable. Without it, the risk was fatal. Competition with rival approaches also emerged. Some squadrons advocated for larger internal tanks, arguing that external stores would always be vulnerable. Others pushed for more efficient engines or lighter airframes. The debate became heated because lives depended on the answer, and nobody knew for certain which approach would work best. The political and military acceptance process was deliberately avoided. Howard and Shafer knew that seeking official approval would trigger reviews, tests, and committees. By the time approval came through, if it came through, hundreds more bombers would be lost. Instead, they focused on proving the concept worked through results. If missions succeeded, if range increased, if losses decreased, the evidence would speak for itself. By late January 1944, the 354th Fighter Group was routinely escorting bombers 500 miles into Germany. Other groups noticed. Some adopted similar procedures, but officially none of this was happening. Reports filed with 8th Air Force Headquarters made no mention of modified fuel management. The innovation was spreading through informal channels, pilot to pilot, crew chief to crew chief, a conspiracy of competence operating outside official sanction. Then, in early February, 8th Air Force Headquarters discovered what was happening. An intelligence report noted P-51s achieving impossible range. Questions were asked. Investigations were threatened. Orders were issued. All fighter groups will immediately cease unauthorized modifications to fuel management procedures. Violators would face disciplinary action up to and including court-martial. The forbidden modification had been discovered, and it was about to be banned just as it was proving it could work. But its real test was about to come in actual combat. February 11, 1944. Despite headquarters' explicit ban, Lieutenant Colonel James Howard decided his pilots would continue using the modified fuel procedures on one more mission. The target was Frankfurt, 550 miles from boxed impossible range by official doctrine, barely possible with Shafer's modification. Howard knew this could end his career. He also knew bombers would die without adequate escort. The mission brief was tense. Howard explained the situation to his pilots plainly. Headquarters had forbidden the fuel management procedures they'd been using. Continuing would mean disobeying direct orders. Any pilot who wanted to follow standard doctrine could do so without judgment. The room was silent for a moment. Then every pilot volunteered to fly the modified profile. At 7:30 hours, 16 P-51 Mustangs lifted off from Boxted. Each carried two 75-gallon external tanks under the wings. By official calculations, these tanks would get them perhaps 400 miles. By Shafer's calculations, carefully managing fuel between external and internal tanks, they could reach Frankfurt and return. The margin was razor-thin. The flight to Frankfurt took 2 hours. The Mustangs climbed to 27,000 feet, using external fuel for the climb and cruise. German radar tracked them crossing into occupied territory, but Luftwaffe controllers assumed these escorts would turn back soon, as they always did. The German fighters waded deeper inland, preparing to attack bombers after the Americans abandoned them. But the Americans didn't turn back. At 300 miles, still running on external fuel. At 400 miles, switching to internal tanks but keeping external tanks attached in case they held residual fuel. At 500 miles, approaching Frankfurt with bombers still under protection. The Luftwaffe controllers were confused. These fighters shouldn't be here. The range was impossible. Then the attacks came. 30 Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s dove from altitude, expecting easy targets. Instead, they met 16 P-51s ready to fight. Howard led his flight into the German formation. The radios exploded with calls, "Break left. 109 high. I'm on him." The sky became a swirling dogfight at 25,000 feet. But here's where it gets interesting. The P-51 pilots, despite carrying external tanks into combat, weren't at a fatal disadvantage. They'd practiced emergency jettison so thoroughly that tanks came off in less than 2 seconds when needed. The initial disadvantage of drag disappeared the moment combat began, and they had the fuel reserves to fight aggressively. The engagement lasted 25 minutes. When it ended, 8 German fighters were destroyed or damaged, and not a single American fighter or bomber was lost. The Mustangs still had enough fuel to escort bombers to Frankfurt, protect them during the bomb run, and shepherd them partway home before their own fuel states forced them to break off. Howard landed at Boxted with his fuel gauge showing nearly empty. The ground crew swarmed his aircraft, measuring remaining fuel. He had 7 gallons left, about 6 minutes of flight time. The other pilots reported similar margins. The mission had worked, but barely. One miscalculation, one navigation error, one prolonged dogfight, and pilots would have run dry over the channel. The intelligence debrief that followed was awkward. Howard had to explain how his group achieved impossible range while technically violating the orders that had just been issued. His report was carefully worded. He emphasized results over methods, highlighting bomber protection rather than fuel management procedures. 2 days later, Howard received a message from 8th Air Force Headquarters. "Report to High Wycombe immediately." He expected court-martial proceedings. Instead, he was escorted to a meeting with Major General William Kepner, commanding WWII Fighter Command. Kepner wanted to understand exactly how Howard's group was achieving such range, and more importantly, he wanted to know if it could be taught to every fighter group in England. This was just the beginning. What came next would cement its legendary status. By March 1944, the forbidden modification was at the height of its power, and now it was officially sanctioned. Major General Kepner, after reviewing Howard's results and Shafer's procedures, issued new directives to all fighter groups. External fuel tanks would be used according to the modified procedures developed by the 354th Fighter Group. What had been forbidden was now doctrine. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Fighter groups that had been turning back at 400 miles were now reaching Berlin at 600 miles. Bomber losses plummeted. Missions that had seen 15–20% losses in late 1943 were now losing 2–3%. The Luftwaffe, which had controlled the skies beyond a certain point, suddenly faced American fighters everywhere. The mission that saved 9 pilots came on March 6, 1944. Lieutenant Colonel Howard was leading his group on bomber escort to Berlin. The formation included 150 B-17s from multiple bomb groups. As they crossed into Germany, mechanical problems began plaguing the bomber stream. One B-17 lost 2 engines. Another suffered hydraulic failure. A third took flak damage over the target. The crippled bombers couldn't keep formation pace. They fell behind, becoming stragglers, the easiest targets for German fighters. Standard procedure was for escorts to stay with the main formation, leaving stragglers to their fate. Individual bombers couldn't be protected without abandoning the larger group. It was brutal math, sacrifice a few to save many. But Howard's modified fuel procedures changed that calculation. His P-51s had fuel reserves that previous escorts lacked. He could split his force, sending some Mustangs to stay with stragglers while others continued with the main formation. He made the call. 4 P-51s would shepherd the damaged B-17s home. Stay with me because this next part is crucial. The 9 stragglers, the count had grown as more bombers developed problems, limped westward at reduced altitude and speed. German fighters stalked them, waiting for the escorts to leave. But the escorts didn't leave. The 4 P-51s, flying a modified fuel profile that gave them extra range, stayed with the bombers all the way back to the English coast. The attacks came in waves. Bf-109s dove from altitude. The P-51s intercepted, shooting down 2. FW-190s tried to slip underneath. The Mustangs dropped to block them, damaging 1. For 200 miles, across Germany and over the Channel, the 4 escorts fought off repeated attacks while 9 bomber crews, 90 men, struggled to keep their damaged aircraft flying. The statistics tell the story. Between March and May 1944, bomber losses over Germany dropped by 70%. Fighter groups were achieving combat radii of 650 miles, allowing them to escort bombers to any target in Germany. The strategic bombing campaign, which had been unsustainable in late 1943, became devastatingly effective. German industrial production faltered under sustained bombing that the Luftwaffe could no longer prevent. Famous missions became possible. The first Berlin escort mission in early March, the attacks on Romanian oil fields at Ploesti, the support for D-Day operations in June. All of these required the extended range that Shafer's modification provided. Without it, fighters would have been relegated to short-range patrols, while bombers faced unescorted missions to critical targets. Notable pilots achieved their victories using the modified procedures. Captain Don Gentile, the 4th Fighter Group's top ace, credited extended range with giving him opportunities to engage German fighters that previous escorts never saw. Major George Preddy used the extra fuel to pursue damaged German aircraft back to their bases, destroying them before they could land and be repaired. The comparison with enemy aircraft also shifted. German fighters had always had range advantages when operating over their own territory. They could land and refuel quickly. But now American fighters with modified fuel management could loiter over German airspace, turning the range equation in America's favor. But every legend has its darkest moment. Despite its success, the modified fuel management system wasn't invincible. The extended range came with risks that killed pilots who made mistakes or encountered bad luck. Understanding these vulnerabilities is crucial to understanding why the modification was controversial for so long. The most critical weakness was the margin for error. Pilots flying extended-range missions operated on fuel calculations with almost no safety buffer. One navigation error adding 20 miles to the return trip could mean ditching in the channel. One prolonged dogfight burning fuel at combat power could leave a pilot swimming in the North Sea. The modified procedures worked, but they required near-perfect execution. Weather was an unpredictable enemy. A headwind on the return journey increased fuel consumption. Cloud cover forcing bombers to circle before landing meant escorts had to circle too, burning precious fuel. Several pilots made it to the English coast, but ran dry before finding their home base, crash landing in fields or bailing out over friendly territory. The losses were real and painful. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, following modified fuel procedures on a March mission, miscalculated his reserves and went down 50 miles from England. He was rescued from the Channel but suffered hypothermia that ended his combat career. Captain Thomas Hayes ran dry trying to shepherd damaged bombers home, successfully protecting them, but dying himself when his engine quit and his aircraft plunged into the sea. Enemy countermeasures evolved. German fighters learned to avoid prolonged engagements with American escorts, instead making quick hit-and-run attacks that forced P-51s to burn fuel at combat power without achieving decisive results. Luftwaffe tactics shifted to attacking bombers during the brief windows when escorts were switching fuel tanks, exploiting the momentary vulnerability. The paper construction of early external tanks proved particularly problematic. The British manufactured tanks, made from compressed paper and glue to save metal, sometimes disintegrated in flight. Pieces would tear off, creating dangerous debris. Other times, tanks would split open, dumping fuel that occasionally ignited. Several aircraft were lost to tank failures that had nothing to do with enemy action. Difficult missions revealed other problems. Long flights at high altitude caused fuel line freeze-ups. Mechanical fuel transfer pumps failed, forcing pilots to rely on gravity feed that didn't work well in combat maneuvering. Tank jettison mechanisms that worked perfectly in testing sometimes jammed in combat, leaving pilots fighting with drag-inducing tanks they couldn't drop. The psychological toll was significant. Pilots flying extended-range missions knew they were operating at the edge of possible. Every mission was a calculated risk. Some pilots developed obsessive habits, checking fuel gauges constantly, calculating remaining range obsessively. A few requested transfers rather than continue flying missions that left no margin for error. The official statistics, when finally compiled, showed that approximately 5% of fighters flying extended-range missions were lost to fuel-related causes. That's lower than combat losses, but higher than losses from mechanical failure. The modification worked, but it wasn't free. Pilots paid for extended range with increased risk, and some paid with their lives. Yet one mission would prove why this modification earned its place in history. January 11, 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final phase, but German resistance remained fierce. A massive bombing raid targeting industrial facilities at Magdeburg was underway, 900 bombers escorted by 400 fighters, one of the largest air operations of the war. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard, now commanding an entire fighter wing, led a formation of 48 P-51 Mustangs as part of the escort. The mission brief was complex. The bombers would strike Magdeburg, 480 miles from England, then continue to secondary targets before returning. Total mission time, over 7 hours. Only fighters using modified fuel management could sustain such duration. This mission represented everything Shafer's forbidden modification had made possible: deep penetration, extended loiter time, and the ability to stay with bombers through multiple target runs. At 10:30 hours, the formation crossed into German airspace. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them in force, an estimated 120 fighters, including some of the new jet-powered Me-262s that were faster than any propeller aircraft. The German plan was clear: overwhelm the escorts with numbers, break through to the bombers, and inflict maximum casualties. The battle that followed was the largest air engagement of 1945. It began at 26,000 feet over Brunswick and sprawled across 200 miles of German sky. Howard's fighters engaged immediately, trying to keep the German interceptors away from the bomber stream. The modified fuel procedures became critical. Instead of being forced to disengage after 20 minutes of combat, the P-51s could fight for 45 minutes and still have fuel to complete the mission. This is where things took a dramatic turn. A formation of 24 FW-190s broke through the escort screen and dove toward the bombers. Captain William Wissner, leading a flight of 4 P-51s, pursued them down from 26,000 to 8,000 feet. Normally, such a long chase would leave escorts with barely enough fuel to return to altitude and resume patrol. With the modified fuel management, Wissner could chase the German fighters to low altitude, destroy 3 of them, and climb back to escort position with adequate reserves. The engagement lasted 90 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat. The P-51s using modified fuel procedures rotated through combat, some fighting while others conserved fuel, all coordinating to maintain continuous protection over the bomber formation. German fighters that tried to wait out the Americans, expecting escorts to run low on fuel and disengage, found themselves still facing fresh opponents an hour into the battle. The results were decisive. American fighters destroyed 47 German aircraft confirmed, with another 30 probably destroyed or damaged. Bomber losses were minimal, just 8 of 900, less than 1%. Without the extended combat time provided by modified fuel management, bomber losses would likely have exceeded 50. The difference was lives, 500 men who went home instead of dying over Germany. Howard later wrote in his mission report, "The modified fuel procedures developed by Technical Sergeant Shafer and refined through operational experience have fundamentally altered the tactical equation. Enemy fighters can no longer wait for American escorts to depart. They must engage in our presence or allow bombers to strike unhindered." That single sentence captured the strategic transformation. What had begun as a forbidden field modification had evolved into the tactical doctrine that made strategic bombing effective. The Luftwaffe, once able to time their attacks for the moment American escorts turned back, now faced continuous pressure throughout bomber missions. The Magdeburg mission proved that extended range wasn't just about reaching distant targets. It was about maintaining combat effectiveness throughout the mission. It was about having the fuel to fight, pursue, and fight again. It was about turning the air war from a sprint into a marathon that German fighters, operating over their own territory with limited fuel, could no longer win. As the war progressed, the modified fuel management would continue to evolve. By early 1945, the forbidden modification that had started in one maintenance hangar had become standardized doctrine across all American fighter operations in Europe. But the innovation didn't stop. As the war entered its final months, pilots and engineers continued refining the procedures that Shafer had pioneered. The most significant late-war modification was the adoption of larger external tanks. The original 75-gallon tanks were replaced with 110-gallon and eventually 150-gallon drop tanks. These larger tanks, combined with refined fuel management procedures, extended P-51 combat radius to over 850 miles. Fighters based in England could now escort bombers to targets in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Austria areas that had been unreachable just a year earlier. New roles emerged from the extended range capability. Fighter groups began conducting freelance missions, flying deep into Germany to strafe airfields, shoot up trains, and attack targets of opportunity. These missions, lasting up to 8 hours, would have been impossible without the modified fuel management. Pilots like Lieutenant Colonel John Mayer pioneered tactics for these extended operations, demonstrating that fighters could be more than just bomber escorts. The adaptation to changing tactics was constant. As German jet aircraft became more common in early 1945, American pilots developed procedures for engaging Me-262s while managing fuel carefully. The jets were faster but had limited endurance. P-51 pilots learned to force jets into prolonged maneuvering that exhausted their fuel, then pursue them back to base. This tactic only worked because the P-51s had the fuel reserves to wait out the jets. Final major operations demonstrated the modification's full potential. The March 1945 Berlin raids saw over 1,300 bombers and 750 fighters operating simultaneously over Germany. Fighter coverage was continuous from takeoff to landing. The Luftwaffe, once a formidable force, was reduced to ineffectiveness. The air superiority that made the final Allied advances possible was built on the foundation of extended-range fighter operations. But here's what made the late war period particularly significant. The modification's influence spread beyond just fuel management. The success of field expedient solutions encouraged a broader culture of tactical innovation. Fighter groups experimented with new formations, communication procedures, and combat techniques. The rigid doctrine that had existed in 1943 gave way to flexible, adaptive tactics developed by the men actually flying combat missions. Total production numbers tell the story of institutional acceptance. By war's end, over 15,000 modified external tanks had been manufactured specifically for the fuel management procedures Shafer developed. What had been a forbidden field modification became a major production program. Factories that once made tanks according to specifications designed for ferry flights were now producing tanks optimized for combat operations. Different variants of the fuel management system emerged for different aircraft types. P-47 Thunderbolts, which had even worse range than early P-51s, adopted modified procedures that extended their combat radius from 230 miles to nearly 500 miles. P-38 Lightnings used a different approach with their twin engines, but the fundamental concept, use external fuel first, internal fuel last, manage consumption precisely, remained the same. The training programs were formalized. New pilots arriving in theater received standardized instruction in extended-range fuel management. What Howard and Shafer had developed through trial and error became part of basic combat training. The Air Force published technical orders codifying the procedures. The forbidden modification became official doctrine taught to every fighter pilot. Recognition came slowly but eventually. Technical Sergeant Shafer received the Bronze Star for his innovation. Lieutenant Colonel Howard received the Medal of Honor. Though officially for a different action, everyone knew his leadership in developing and championing the modified fuel procedures had been equally significant. The citations didn't mention the modifications explicitly, but pilots understood what was being honored. The technology transfer to other theaters was rapid. Fighter groups in the Pacific, facing even greater range challenges, adopted the modified fuel management procedures. P-51s escorting B-29s over Japan used the same techniques developed over Germany. P-38s flying long patrols over the Pacific applied the same principles. The innovation that started in one European maintenance hangar eventually influenced air operations worldwide. By April 1945, German resistance was collapsing. Fighter pilots flying missions deep into Germany reported encountering minimal opposition. The Luftwaffe had been ground down through attrition, its fuel supplies exhausted, its experienced pilots dead or captured. The extended-range fighters that once seemed impossible were now patrolling German skies with impunity. And then came the moment that would define its legacy. When the war ended on May 8, 1945, the modified fuel management procedures had fundamentally transformed aerial warfare. Fighter groups flying extended-range missions had escorted over 200,000 bomber sorties deep into Germany. The strategic bombing campaign that had been unsustainable in 1943 had become devastatingly effective by 1945, largely because fighters could now protect bombers throughout entire missions. Statistics tell a remarkable story. Between March 1944, when the modification became official doctrine, and May 1945, bomber losses over Germany dropped by 75%. This represented thousands of aircraft saved and tens of thousands of aircrews who returned home instead of dying or being captured. The modification that military brass had initially forbidden had saved more American lives than any single tactical innovation of the European air war. The total war contribution was staggering. Fighter groups using extended-range procedures flew over 150,000 combat sorties. They destroyed approximately 6,000 German aircraft in air-to-air combat aircraft that otherwise would have been shooting at unescorted bombers. They enabled strategic bombing to continue through the final year of the war, directly contributing to Germany's industrial collapse. Post-war service of the modified fuel management doctrine extended well beyond 1945. The procedures became standard in the newly independent U.S. Air Force, codified in training manuals and technical orders. Korea-era F-86 Sabres used similar fuel management concepts. Vietnam-era F-4 Phantoms applied the same principles with air refueling added to the equation. The fundamental insight, manage fuel precisely to maximize combat effectiveness, remained relevant through decades of technological change. Export to other nations spread the innovation globally. Royal Air Force squadrons adopted the procedures for their Mustangs and Tempests. French, Dutch, and Belgian air forces incorporated the techniques into their post-war training. By the 1950s, extended-range fuel management had become standard doctrine for fighter operations worldwide, though few people remembered it had started as a forbidden field modification. The peacetime roles of aircraft using these procedures expanded military aviation's possibilities. Long-range ferry flights became routine. Fighter deployments across oceans became feasible. The strategic mobility of air power increased dramatically because fighters could now travel vast distances without constant aerial refueling or elaborate support infrastructure. Recognition of the modification's importance came gradually. In 1947, the Air Force published a technical history of the European air war that devoted an entire chapter to extended-range fuel management. The report credited Shafer's innovation with enabling the final year of strategic bombing operations. In 1952, Howard was promoted to brigadier general, his career having survived and ultimately thrived despite his early willingness to defy orders. Technical Sergeant Shafer remained relatively unknown outside aviation circles. He returned to Iowa after the war, worked as a mechanic, and rarely spoke about his contribution. In 1984, a military aviation magazine tracked him down and interviewed him. When asked about the modification that had saved thousands of lives, he responded, "We just did what made sense. The book said one thing, but the book was wrong, so we did what worked instead." Surviving aircraft today occasionally demonstrate the techniques. Restored P-51 Mustangs at airshows sometimes fly with period-accurate external tanks, and pilots explain to audiences how fuel management made the difference between 400-mile and 850-mile range. The tanks themselves, aluminum cylinders that seem unremarkable, represent one of the war's most significant tactical innovations. Museums display the story with varying accuracy. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force has an exhibit on extended-range fighter operations, though it downplays the forbidden modification aspect in favor of a smoother narrative about engineering progress. The truth, that critical innovation came from defying authority, doesn't always fit comfortable institutional histories. Looking back, the forbidden modification was more than just a fuel management technique. Looking back, the forbidden modification was more than just a fuel management technique. It represented a fundamental shift in how military organizations approach innovation during wartime. The story demonstrates that sometimes the best solutions come from the field, not from headquarters, and that institutional resistance to new ideas can cost lives. The overall impact on World War II was decisive. Strategic bombing, which had been failing in late 1943 due to unsustainable losses, became the war-winning capability that military planners had envisioned. The ability to strike German industry continuously, forcing the Luftwaffe to defend everywhere simultaneously, drained German resources and hastened the war's end. None of this would have been possible without fighters that could escort bombers throughout entire missions. The technological innovations the modification introduced were deceptively simple but profoundly important. The concept of precisely managing fuel between multiple tanks, of using external stores as primary fuel rather than emergency reserves, of calculating range based on mission profiles rather than maximum theoretical distance, these ideas seem obvious in retrospect. But in 1943, they were revolutionary, contradicting established doctrine and requiring pilots to rethink everything they'd been taught. The influence on future aircraft design was substantial. Post-war fighters were designed from the beginning with extended-range operations in mind. External tanks became standard equipment rather than ferry flight accessories. Fuel management systems became more sophisticated, but the underlying principle remained the same: maximize operational range through careful management of available resources. Why is the modification remembered today? Partly because it worked so well. 75% reduction in bomber losses is an undeniable success, but also because it represents a particular kind of innovation, the field expedient solution that proves superior to the official approach. Military historians study this case as an example of how wartime necessity can drive innovation faster than peacetime bureaucracy. The place in aviation history is secure but understated. Most aviation enthusiasts know that P-51s escorted bombers to Berlin. Fewer know that this was only possible because of modified fuel management procedures that were initially forbidden. The modification doesn't have the glamour of a new aircraft design or the drama of a famous battle, but it changed the air war as fundamentally as any technological advancement. The final statistics summary tells the complete story. 15,000 modified external tanks produced, 150,000 combat sorties flown, 6,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, 75% reduction in bomber losses, thousands of American lives saved. And it all started with a crew chief who believed the book was wrong and a commander willing to risk his career to prove it. So there you have it, the complete story of the forbidden modification that changed World War II. From Technical Sergeant Bob Shafer's unauthorized experiments in a maintenance hangar to Lieutenant Colonel James Howard's career-risking decision to use the procedures in combat, this innovation proved that sometimes the best ideas come from the people closest to the problem. 15,000 modified external tanks were produced, enabling 150,000 combat sorties that destroyed 6,000 enemy aircraft and reduced bomber losses by 75%. 9 pilots were saved on that March 1944 mission, but thousands more were saved over the following year because fighters finally had the range to protect them throughout entire missions. It remains one of the most important tactical innovations of the European air war. The modification succeeded because it solved a real problem that headquarters had been ignoring. It proved that field innovation, even when it violates official doctrine, can be more effective than solutions developed through traditional channels. The lesson resonates today. Sometimes you have to defy authority to save lives, and sometimes the book is wrong. What impressed you most about this story? Was it Shafer's innovation, Howard's courage in defying orders, or the fact that something so simple made such a massive difference? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more deep dives into WWII's untold stories, the innovations, the decisions, and the people who changed history, subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're covering the stories that don't make it into traditional histories, but that won the war. Thanks for watching WWII Aviation, and I'll see you in the next one.